One of the things that you mentioned was people who are in a lower carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic state are experiencing maybe a state of chronic stress. Could we kind of dive into a little bit of why that might be?
So caloric restriction in general is known to upregulate all of the stress systems. It's not really even debated. Where things maybe get a little bit confusing is like on the source of the calories that you're getting. So, even if you're on a low carb diet, but you are like eating sufficient amounts of calories, glucose or carbohydrate in the diet is the body's primary signal of abundance. It's the metabolic substrate of your hypothalamus and of your pituitary that is able to shut down these different hormonal cascades that end up lowering your stress. And then when it doesn't get that fuel, then the stress systems are activated. Cortisol and related stress hormones are in a class of hormones called glucocorticoids. And that is because they help your body release glucose in response to not having enough on hand. Well understood that is one of the primary objectives of the stress system is to liberate more energy, specifically glucose, in response to an increased demand. So obviously if you're in a situation where you're not eating glucose at all, your body has no choice but to activate those stress systems.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Peak Players podcast with myself, Anthony Emanuel. Today we are joined by two of my favorite creators in the health and nutrition space right now. We have Jack and Dalton, who are the visionaries behind the online brand Analyze and Optimize, who are committed to the elevating and the well-being and vitality of their followers through core bioenergetic strategies, reigniting a sense of youth and awe. And believe me, when you get into this stuff, the awe part is real. Expanding their mission, they've recently introduced Prism, a health consulting venture that tailors this transformative approach to the individual needs of each client. We'll be talking about that later. First of all, guys, stoked to have you here. You are, like I said, two of my favorite creators in this space, talking about some of my favorite topics that not a lot of people are talking about, and honestly, that a lot of people kind of get freaked out a little bit because it's a little away from some of the mainstream points of view. So thanks for coming on here and for having these conversations today.
Wow.
Thanks for having us, man.
What an intro. I'm like ready to run into war now. Visionary. I never got that one. Thank you, man. Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, so I'd love to talk to you about some first principles that you guys work with when we talk about a bioenergetics-first approach. Defining what bioenergetics is probably a good place to start. So when we're talking about this, because I think that's going to be the core of our conversation today, what do we mean when we say bioenergetics?
So, obviously there's different interpretations of things, but the way that I look at it, the key word would be metabolism. And metabolism is simply the exchanging of different chemical compounds within the body. And typically when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about energy metabolism. So the conversion of your food and eventually down into energy that you can actually use. Yeah, that would be the most basic understanding of it. And what I think bioenergetics, at least in the way that I typically use the term, is you are basically using this concept of metabolism, energy metabolism, to structure the way that you live, in the sense that you are trying to optimize your ability to make these chemical interconversions. And it's not even just energy. It could be steroid hormones, or it could be nutrient utilization, et cetera, anything in the body that needs interconversion. I think the idea is to optimize those processes and then, kind of designing the diet, the lifestyle, and everything else to facilitate that. And in the process, minimizing the stress responses, which tends to inhibit all of those aforementioned processes. That would be kind of the elevator pitch from my perspective.
Right. So we're looking to maximize energy production, minimize stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other big thing is really listening to the body. Ray Peat's famous quote is, "Authoritarians talk about protocols, but the only valid protocol would be something like perceive, think, act." And I think that is a beautiful quote. Everyone regurgitates it for a reason, and it's because people should try to listen to their bodies. I think that's a key component to all of this, is that, it tries not to be dogmatic. It's more about the individual and following intuition.
So I have a question about that because that's something that I have heard a lot where it's like listen to your body. But I also recognize that when a person's in a state of metabolic dysfunction, the signals that their body can give are oftentimes sort of they have crossed wires and they're getting false signals from their body. There's a great book called The Hungry Brain that kind of talks about exaggerated appetites from people who have metabolic dysfunctions or are conditioned by these sort of engineered foods with hyperpalatability. And sometimes listening to your body is not the best approach. And so when you have a person who's in a state of metabolic dysfunction, where's the balance between applying a certain protocol to repair the metabolism and having them get the active feedback and awareness and interoception of their body state?
Yeah, so I definitely agree. I've definitely gotten that comment before where it's like, all right, well, if I listen to my body, then I would just sit on the couch all day and do nothing and eat potato chips and take naps and whatnot. So I guess maybe not as in like a literal sense as like, oh, just do whatever your immediate like impulse tells you to do. Rather, like try to understand the concept that like, the body is like this incredible, intelligent apparatus, if you will, that is constantly giving and taking signals from the environment. So, for instance, if you talk about someone with metabolic dysfunction having a higher appetite, or maybe they have more salt craving or more sugar craving, maybe it's not as simple as, oh, well, the brain's like wrong, so you shouldn't listen to it. It's more, why is the brain perhaps having that craving? Is it because the person's under a tremendous amount of stress and because those are nutrients that, oppose stress? Is it because the person on a functional cellular level is not actually utilizing their energy, so therefore they're perceiving the need for more energy? Those are the more important things. And, it can take quite a while because, you are trying to decipher these signals as you go. And you'll be wrong a lot of the time. It can take iterations and months and years to really like learn your body and try to figure those things out. But I think, everyone is probably better off for doing that. And it's not really something that tends to be focused on a lot. And especially in the sense where, everyone knows about like a gut feeling or like following your heart and things like that. But, I think a lot of times in today's world, we're kind of taught to like shun that to the side and just keep going. And, this is healthy for you. It doesn't matter if you don't like it. Like it is healthy. So just keep doing it. You don't know any better. Things like that. I think that those kind of dogmas are not very useful.
Another thing I would say is to really focus on what goes on later on, because a lot of things could feel good right away. But if you really take note of how you feel a couple hours later, at the end of the day, based on what you do and you actually pay attention to what goes on after the immediate, I think you can get a much better understanding of what's actually good for you. Because obviously if you sit on the couch all day, it's going to feel good in the moment. But when you finish the day, you'd have been much better off like doing something that was actually fulfilling to you. And if you kind of take note of that, same thing with eating fast food or something like that, it's obviously going to feel good in the moment. But then later on, hour, 2 hours later, you're not going to feel great.
Yeah. And like trying to, like on top of that, like trying to understand like why something makes you feel good as well. So like, for instance, like in the past, I used to be really into fasting and like, I would feel amazing if I didn't eat for 3 days. But, does that automatically mean that that's healthy? I mean, I would feel amazing doing a lot of things that aren't very healthy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is conducive to health. So, yeah, I think it's important to also try to understand the why behind these things. And, it can be obviously difficult to figure it out, but it's kind of why we do what we do. So.
I think, just as you were talking, one of the things that came to mind is you can actually maybe even use like some of these inappropriate signals as the thing that you're analyzing, where it's like, man, I'm hungry all the time, even though I'm eating a lot. That's something that you would like kind of, you're listening to your body. It's like, that's a crossed wire. That's an inappropriate signal. So I'm going to experiment and I'm going to try to optimize for having a lower appetite throughout the day and getting more nutrients or whatever have you, right? And you can kind of use that as the feedback and not necessarily as the signal of like, oh, I feel like doing this now in the moment, and so I will. But it's more you're just kind of analyzing, I feel this way and I don't necessarily want to. How could I change that. Now, one of the things that you mentioned a couple of times is this idea of like lowering stress response and lowering stress. And the fasting thing is interesting, right? Because fasting is a stressor. And, I've also done a lot of prolonged fasting, 3, 4, 5 day fasts, and you feel awesome. You get the euphoric sense, and then, maybe go back to eating and you don't feel as great. And it's an interesting thing. You're like, you start to feel sluggish and heavy, and your solution is like, oh, I should probably fast again.
Yeah.
And, I'm fascinated by this idea of acute stress and hormetic stress. And obviously it's a pretty well known and well practiced thing that if you want to grow and you want to adapt to things, you apply stress to your system, and then you become more resilient. You become basically more resilient and more adapted to these types of stress. And so in a bioenergetics first approach where you're trying to minimize the stress response, what role does acute, hormetic, or deliberately applied stress play in your approach?
Yeah, so I think the key here is like basically like the acute versus the chronic. So, like before this podcast, I was doing some deadlifts. That was obviously like an acute stressor, but in the long run, it's probably going to reduce the stress on my body because I'll be able to dispose of free fatty acids more effectively, which is going to make my glucose tolerance better. It'll be better for my hormones. It'll be better for my energy, better for my sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think the concept of hormesis is definitely interesting. I do think it can be like misunderstood or at least misutilized as a term because, if you're just like doing one meal a day or whatever, that's not really hormesis because you're constantly putting yourself under that stress. Or if you're doing a low carb diet, for months and months and years, it's not really hormesis at that point. You're kind of just under chronic stress. And, even proponents of, things like ice baths or ketogenic diets or fasting or whatever the stressor may be, I don't think any of those people would necessarily argue that a chronic stressor is good. So yeah, I really think it's about understanding that. And it's a concept that you kind of see over and over, acute versus chronic, like those maybe getting a little bit misconstrued. So one thing that I see all the time is like, oh, that'll spike your blood sugar. And like, we know that that's like bad. But the thing is, if it's like an acute spiking of your blood sugar that comes down because the rest of your body is metabolizing the sugar, then it's not a bad thing. Now, if your blood sugar is elevated all the time, then that's a really bad thing because that means you have diabetes. So, these things, there's definitely more context behind it. But yeah, I mean, personally, I'm not like of the belief like some maybe that, you just never like want to put yourself under stress or things like that because, I mean, it's life. Like the old saying that like, yeah, at the end of the day, like the old saying that like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And like, that's kind of what life is all about is overcoming things and, learning from them and whatnot. So I don't think it's necessarily about never being under stress, but I think that your baseline state should be one that is lower stress. And then if you have to encounter stressors, then you're like more prepared to do that. Whereas, if you're under a chronic like stress and you're just always wired or you're just always fatigued or whatever, then you're obviously not going to be able to handle any acute stressor effectively.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is like, keep your baseline levels of stress low, your baseline levels of like just your nice high metabolic state, nice, relaxed state in general. And then you can apply acute stressors to elicit specific responses, specific adaptations, and you're more equipped and more ready to adapt to them because your ability to enter states of recovery are probably
absolutely
more efficient.
And that's and that's what the stress systems are for. They're for acute situations of extremely high energy demand when you need to employ those things. So if you're, I don't know, if you get into a fight or something, yeah, you shouldn't just be relaxed through that whole situation. You should, you should be amped up and ready to go and elicit the stress response. But you also shouldn't be walking around wanting to pick a fight with everyone, right? So
one of the things that you mentioned was people who are in a lower carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic state are experiencing maybe a state of chronic stress. Could we kind of dive into a little bit of why that might be? If someone's in a low carb diet for years and years and years, why could that be considered a state of chronic stress?
Yeah, I mean, it is, so caloric restriction in general is known to upregulate all of the stress systems. It's not really even debated. The question I think becomes like where things maybe get a little bit confusing is like on the source of the calories that you're getting. So, even if you're on a low carb diet, but you are like eating sufficient amounts of calories, glucose or carbohydrate in the diet is the body's primary signal of abundance. It's the metabolic substrate of your hypothalamus and of your pituitary that is able to shut down these different hormonal cascades that end up lowering your stress. And then when it doesn't get that fuel, then the stress systems are activated. In fact, I think one of the easiest ways to think about it is that cortisol and related stress hormones are in a class of hormones called glucocorticoids, and that is because they help your body release glucose in response to not having enough on hand. It's pretty well understood that is one of the primary objectives of the stress system is to liberate more energy, specifically glucose, in response to an increased demand. So obviously, if you're in a situation where you're not eating glucose at all, your body has no choice but to activate those stress systems. And then, you also have things like glucagon, which are, considered stress hormones as well. Like if you administer glucagon to someone, you will see the classic stress phenotypes, even though it's not typically thought of as a stress hormone. And then there's kind of debate about does this actually like raise your cortisol levels or whatever. And it's not that that's not like an important conversation to have, but I think that there's a lot more to the story than just like a blood level of a hormone. So for instance, cortisol, it's not like just one isolated hormone. There's cortisone and a bunch of other related steroid hormones to cortisol. So if you're in a situation where, okay, I've been on the keto diet for a while, or I've been under this chronic stress for a while, but my cortisol levels are not high, well, you could have a situation where there are precursor cortisol hormones that are essentially circulating at a higher level, reaching your tissues, and then being activated within cells to the active cortisol or whatever the case may be. The bottom line is that, if you are in a situation where you need to activate gluconeogenesis or activate lipolysis, and that's the releasing of sugar and fat from stores, then there's no other way to do it other than to utilize these pathways. You simply are not going to be able to do it. Whether or not that shows up on a blood test is kind of neither here nor there, because it's the fundamentals of how stress works.
Right. And so what I'm hearing is if you have adequate amounts of glucose in your diet, you're going to not have to, out of necessity, activate these stress pathways. And so your system fundamentally is going to be less stressed. What other positive beneficial implications to metabolism does that have when you are in that state of abundance?
So one thing I would say is that I don't want people to hear that and be like, oh, so if I eat carbs, then I'll just never be stressed. That is also definitely not true. Not that you were insinuating that, but just to clear things up. So you can obviously be under stress from a number of different things. Carbohydrate is a primary signal to lower it. But in terms of the other important metabolic benefits, I think the key one is to lower the amount of free fatty acids in the blood. So essentially, you have stored fat tissue, obviously, and then everyone kind of knows that the fat tissue is there because if your body doesn't have enough energy on hand, then it starts to release it. That's the whole point, right? Well, it turns out that is really more of a function of glucose intake rather than anything. You'll have higher circulating free fatty acids if you're on under any type of stress or under a carbohydrate restricted diet. And this might not sound like a bad thing. Okay, I'm burning more fat. Isn't that good? Well, the thing is, you don't want to have high levels of circulating free fatty acids, just like you don't want to have chronically high levels of glucose. These are fuels that should be taken up into cells and then used appropriately. But having them chronically elevated is not a good thing. And, I did an entire thread on Twitter that's like, In sepsis, you have elevated free fatty acids. In diabetes, you have elevated levels of free fatty acids. In all cancers, you have high levels of free fatty acids. So, it's not a sign of health to have that elevated. And there's a number of problems with having these free fatty acids elevated. So in the modern world, a lot of those are going to be of the polyunsaturated variety, which is obviously its own whole rabbit hole. But those, can get converted into inflammatory mediators or can get broken down non-enzymatically, producing toxins, can be directly anti-thyroid, things like that. Another problem with having elevated free fatty acids is that they can deposit in your tissues. So, for instance, in laboratory settings, one of the ways that you can actually induce fatty liver acutely is by just taking the food away from the animal for a couple hours. That'll cause the release of all this stored fat, and then it ends up, making its way to the liver. And then it ends up depositing there. So the liver can obviously repackage, metabolize it, or anything else with the fat. But it kind of just goes to show that having the higher circulating amounts of free fatty acids, it can end up depositing on your organs, and that's pretty well known. And then the most important thing of all is that they block your oxidation of glucose. And this has been known since the 1960s. It's called the Randle cycle, when you have high levels of free fatty acids, and then their breakdown products essentially shut down your ability to oxidize glucose. And it's not even just your ability to oxidize glucose. On a mitochondrial level, the over-oxidation of fat tends to suppress the mitochondrial function for a number of different reasons that I don't necessarily need to get into. But yeah, so, and that is a pathway that, people in medicine have been trying to target for forever, is how to lower the free fatty acids for things like diabetes in order to improve glucose tolerance. And it's pretty well known that is, you give people free fatty acids, they can't metabolize glucose. You lower their free fatty acids with something, they can start metabolizing glucose. And the metabolism of glucose is the ultimate sign of health. Not just, we typically think about it with diabetes, but it controls everything. If you can't metabolize glucose, you won't have proper hormonal function. You won't have proper skin turnover. You won't be able to, fuel athletic performance. You won't be able to fuel cognitive performance. All of these things are the result of impaired glucose metabolism. So I think the last thing you would want to do is have lots of free fatty acids in your blood, preventing that process.
So that brings up another question, because the Randle cycle is an argument that a lot of people will use to not have a mixed macronutrient diet, where it's cautioned against consuming high lipid foods or high fat content foods with higher carbohydrate foods, because apparently the consumption of both competes against one another, right? And so it's like you have the fat in your blood and you have the glucose in your blood, and you can only metabolize so much of one or the other. And is that a consideration that you have when you advise people on how they should approach their nutrition? Should you eat carbohydrates or sugars absent of fats, or is that less of a consideration from like a dietary intake perspective?
So I think so acutely, yes, that does matter. So like there was one study where they gave people either a potato or a potato with butter, and the people with the butter potato probably enjoyed it a lot more, but also were not able to metabolize the sugar quite as well. But you still metabolize it. I don't think that's to say that like eating a mixed diet is going to like cause diabetes, because or eating fat and sugar at the same time is going to cause like a chronic level of insulin to be released. I do think that in the acute setting, that is a factor. So yeah, like I'm sitting here drinking this orange juice and there's no oil in it or anything. So obviously in that setting, I'm going to be able to metabolize it quite a bit faster. But, that can also be like advantageous to a certain degree, because, before bed, it's probably better to have that because you're going a longer period without having sugar. So I think you might rather be in a situation where you're metabolizing it a little bit slower and it's getting released a little bit slower. So the thing is, the free fatty acids are really what inhibits the oxidation of glucose. And those are primarily released under stress and under carb restriction. So when you eat dietary fat, you're not necessarily going to get this huge spillover of free fatty acids into the blood when you eat fat, you mainly package it into triglyceride form, and that is circulating the blood. And then those triglycerides don't tend to have this same effect. Now, you can still have some free fatty acid turnover after a higher fat meal, but in general, it's not necessarily something that I would look at and be like, oh, you got to have your carbs and then, wait a certain period of time and then have your fats. I don't look at it that way. And, I think it's also just kind of common sense. If you look at any sort of population that has been living on the planet Earth for any significant amount of time, they all eat like mixed diets. So, try telling like the Italians to not like put, I don't know, butter on their bread, or just eat their bread and their pasta and then have their meat like a couple hours later. It's not going to happen. So
it's not, I'm Italian, and that's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. He's shaking his head at me already. So,
so we all three of us have our glasses of OJ, right? We're talking a lot about glucose and the consumption of carbohydrates as a beneficial thing. And there's a lot of people in the health, fitness, and nutrition space that would say that orange juice is poison, that sugar is poison, that you're spiking your insulin levels, and you have all these negative implications of it being addictive, and that it increases your dopamine levels way above baseline, and then it crashes down below baseline, and that's the sugar crash. So the sugar is poison narrative is very pervasive, and it has been for a very, very long time, or not even a long time, to be honest. Like, historically speaking, it's like a pretty condensed period of history where we started saying sugar is the devil. But I would love to know from your perspective, why do you think that people, from even like a scientific or a historical perspective, why do you think that people perceive sugar as so negative if it does have such a big part in a bioenergetics-first approach? And then how can these misconceptions kind of be reconciled?
I mean, I would probably say there's a number of different reasons, like in research and whatnot, as to why like the sugar is perceived as being bad. I think on the most basic level, like if you're just asking the random person on the street why they think sugar is bad, like they're obviously not going to know. But I think it's kind of goes back to the idea that like inherently like pleasure is bad almost. So like eating sweets is like seen as bad, or like having fun is like seen as bad, and things like that. So I think it's kind of just like a cultural thing to an extent. And then, on the research side of things, there's a number of like different mechanisms that have been like proposed to be the reason that sugar is bad. But I'm not like necessarily convinced by any of them. I think they all have like sort of lack important context. And then it becomes this thing where, it might get mentioned in one paper, and then another paper cites that. And then, after a couple decades, like everyone's citing something that says sugar is bad. But then if you actually test it experimentally, then it's not necessarily the case. I think that if you're like overfeeding sugar in the sense that you're, if you're gaining weight and that weight is coming from eating excess sugar, then it can be more likely to deposit as liver fat. That seems to be the case. I think that only seems to be the case with isolated fructose, which is present in fruit and whatnot. But I think that the whole like fructose versus sucrose and everything else kind of gets a little bit misconstrued as well. Because, you think of sugar, you think of like table sugar, and that is sucrose, which is glucose and fructose linked together. But then a lot of these studies are done in the setting of just feeding animals like isolated fructose, or even feeding people isolated fructose. And that has a completely different metabolic fate and digestive process, which impacts, the effect that it'll have on you. So I think that that's important. There's also just the idea that, having high blood sugar is bad, which it certainly is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like eating lots of sugar is bad. Something else like, having a high amount of cholesterol in the blood may, that's another whole topic, but like people may think that that's bad, but, not eating a bunch of dietary cholesterol doesn't necessarily raise your blood levels of cholesterol. Eating a bunch of calcium does not necessarily raise the amount of calcium in your blood. Eating a lot of magnesium does the same. You can just go down the list. Everything is pretty regulated, and it's not as simple as, oh, just eat this and then it goes up in my blood and it just stays up. There's a lot of metabolic fates to these things. So that would be pretty much like the basic of it. But I think that in general, like, it's always this thing of like, oh, well, we already know sugar's bad, so now we're just gonna like try to figure out why it's bad, rather than actually trying to figure out if it's bad at all, and then having a reason like why it did what it did. So yeah, there's so many proposed mechanisms behind why it's bad. But I'd be sitting here all day if I was listing and debunking every single one of them. But I think that's kind of what it comes down to, is that people like are trying to look for like mechanistic reasons as to why it's bad, as opposed to the alternative.
Right. So it's not necessarily that it was mechanistically proven. It's just that they had pre-assumed they were working on the first principle that sugar was bad, and then was trying to like backtrack and retroactively justify that perspective.
Yeah, and it may even be the case that like some of these mechanisms are true, but they're just taken out of context, because you can have a mechanism that, like, if you just look at it by itself, it may not seem like it's good, but then something else is going on somewhere else, and it's like, oh, well, maybe that counteracts it, or there's some kind of more in detail process of events that's going on here. So yeah, it can get a little tricky to tease these things out, but the simplest thing that, obviously we posted the video recently about how people back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s were eating tons of sugar and they weren't fat or anything. So there's that, but there's plenty of animal research showing that, you can maintain them on a high sugar, like a very high sugar diet. And that's the way that you maintain them. That's the way that you keep them healthy. It's not what you feed them to make them sick. So, if there's like a specific mechanism that we wanted to necessarily dive into more, then we can, but there's just so many. And it's like, I would say that the liver fat is probably like the most pervasive one. And then the blood sugar thing. But other than that, the list just goes on and on and on. And I just haven't particularly been convinced by any of them.
That's fair. There is one fascinating thing that I'm kind of curious about, and that's the difference metabolically between, say, a sucrose or even the fructose in orange juice versus a high fructose corn syrup. And I know you guys have a great video on that kind of differentiates it. But if we could kind of, just for my audience in a nutshell, why is high fructose corn syrup maybe not as metabolically beneficial as, say, consumption of sugars from like a fruit or a fruit juice or a sucrose?
So, like sucrose itself, so like just table sugar versus high fructose corn syrup, is a much simpler discussion to have, so I'll get into that in a sec. What I would say about like whole foods, so honey or fruit or milk or anything like that has carbohydrates in it, you're dealing with such a different beast than just an isolated carbohydrate. You are dealing with so many different peptides, components of the cell membrane, different proteins, different metabolites, different bioactive components. So, there's a study that I posted on Twitter, I think last week, and of course got a lot of pushback, but it was basically saying that if you administered people orange juice, it had this anti-inflammatory effect. So essentially, you could give people like a crappy like McDonald's meal and they get really inflamed. But if you gave them orange juice alongside it, they would mitigate a lot of that. And one thing that was really interesting with that was that everyone was like, oh, but it's still going to spike your blood sugar. But one of the graphs that I posted actually showed that it did not cause the blood sugar to budge at all. Which, yeah, I gave it that same look. That doesn't seem right. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting what happens because a lot of this research is done in a setting where you're feeding people isolated components, which is a lot different than feeding someone a whole food. In terms of high fructose corn syrup versus table sugar, so if anyone doesn't know, Basically, table sugar is sucrose, so a glucose and a fructose linked together. And high fructose corn syrup it's said to be those same simple sugars, but they're not linked together. They're free. There has been a bit of controversy about whether that's actually true. There's been some analyses suggesting that there may actually be quite a bit of cornstarch left in the high fructose corn syrup because that's how it's derived. Mm. And then, just in the animal experiments, all the ones that I've seen pretty much conclusively shown that the feeding of the high fructose corn syrup is much more likely to lead to the depositing of fat on the organs as opposed to sucrose itself. And I think one of the big reasons behind that is because of the way that they get digested. So a lot of people think that if you just eat table sugar, it pretty much just immediately gets cleaved, and then so for all intents and purposes, they should be metabolized the same. But that doesn't actually seem to be the case. If you feed someone isolated fructose, most of it actually doesn't get absorbed in the small intestine where it should be. A lot of it gets metabolized by bacteria in the gut, and that's not really a normal thing to happen. You should not really be having tons of fructose reaching your colon. So the bacteria that can metabolize it can produce a number of different symptoms. In fact, you can administer as little as 10 to 15 grams of isolated fructose. And the majority of people, even if they have normal gut function, will start to have GI upset. They'll start to get gas and bloating and things. And that's because most of it doesn't get metabolized. A lot of it makes its way to the colon, and it basically ferments, and then it creates all this inflammation and this gas. So, you can start to see why that is a much different scenario because, even the most anti-sugar people on the planet, if they had 15 grams or 10 grams of white sugar, probably would not have that response. And that's because glucose and fructose together in the form of sucrose, you are actually able to absorb much more of not just the sucrose, but it improves your nutrient absorption overall in the small intestine. So that's a huge difference, right? So you can't just see an animal study that says, oh, fructose is bad, and then just assume that anything that has fructose in it is going to elicit that same response. Because we really don't eat isolated fructose pretty much ever. It's pretty much exclusively seen in the research in things like, the studies that I just mentioned or animal studies. But in real life, you might be eating high fructose corn syrup, but a lot of times it is just white sugar or things like fruits or honey or whatever the case may be. So it's a whole world of difference. And, these things can obviously send you down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. But that's just kind of the reality of the physical world, that it's confusing and complicated.
It is very, very confusing and complicated. And I think that's why having such a multifaceted approach that you guys do, and you're considering a lot more than just like the food that's going into your body as well. Like the point about feeding these bacteria, for example, I know that you guys have a very gut-centric approach, and things like, if you're overfeeding those bacteria, you can experience issues with something called bacterial endotoxin, which is something that, I first heard when I started reading about Ray Peat stuff. And bacterial endotoxin can affect all kinds of things, including levels of serotonin in your system. And that's another topic that I'd like to get into. But for, again, from this perspective of in terms of gut microbiome and bacterial endotoxin, can we talk a little bit about that and some of the causative factors that or not even the causative factors, some of the things that you would analyze and optimize for in terms of gut health and avoiding issues with things like bacterial endotoxin?
Gotcha. Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't know, endotoxin is essentially a component of a type of bacteria called the gram-negative bacteria. So basically, all bacteria that exists on this planet are divided into either gram-positive or gram-negative. It's not really important to know what that means, but the gram-negative ones contain this endotoxin. So if you are familiar with the classic food poisoning, so like salmonella or E. coli, those happen in large part because of the endotoxin. So in fact, in studies, when they're isolating out endotoxin, they normally take it from E. coli. So, that kind of gives you an idea of what it does for your body. But yeah, it's one of the primary inflammatory signals in the body. And, it doesn't necessarily just have to come from an overt food poisoning, because a lot of the resident bacteria in your gut do contain this lipopolysaccharide, this endotoxin. So if you're in a situation where the immunity is impaired, the metabolism is impaired, maybe gut motility is not working properly, or any number of other reasons, then the lining of the intestine can become like leaky. Basically, it allows for permeability, and that can result in bacterial translocation into the blood. So you think about infections generally. I liken this to if you get a cut and bacteria start to go inside you, that's a really big problem. Normally there's bacteria everywhere and it's not an issue because we're all plugged up. Nothing's getting inside us. But if something is open and allowing bacteria to come in, then this one becomes a serious problem, right? But the main way that they seem to get in is through your gut, and it's not intentional most of the time. It's because of things like stress and impaired immunity. So in terms of optimizing gut function, there's so much more that goes into it, and the microbiome is its own whole beast that we are still trying to get a grip on. But I would say that endotoxin is a serious problem, and I think most of the time when people are currently struggling with those issues, a lot of it comes down to having just overt bacterial overgrowth. And it's kind of a controversial opinion because a lot of the talk is about good bacteria, bad bacteria, dysbiosis. But in my estimation, it often comes down to, you probably have bad bacteria or dysbiosis, but it really comes down to you just have too damn much. So it's been established that people with any number of different gut symptoms, they basically have either higher bacterial counts or higher fecal loads. So basically they produce more waste from their food, and that's in large part because the waste is primarily comprised of bacteria, and that can drive all number of these symptoms: bloating, gas, pain, etc., indigestion. All of those things can be the result of the bacterial buildup. So, I typically, when I am looking at individuals with these problems, some of the first things that I will, probe for is the bowel function, the bowel movements. And then also a dead giveaway most of the time is the tongue. So if you wake up in the morning and you look at your tongue and it has a coating on it, that's one of the most reliable ways, just in my experience. There's actually not a ton of research on it, but it's one of the most reliable ways to know if you have some kind of bacterial overgrowth going on. And most people have it and they don't even realize because everyone has it. But yeah, it's a dead giveaway. And if you have that, then you're probably looking at some kind of deep rooted, whether it's a gut infection necessarily, or just some kind of bacterial overgrowth that's going on there. That's probably what you need to address before anything else, because I see it all the time where people are trying to tweak their diet, tweak this, tweak their thyroid, tweak that. And nothing seems to really be working. But if your gut is in a state where it's very inflamed or it's not digesting properly, then none of that other stuff matters. I mean, if you have good gut function, you will be healthier than the guy over you if you're eating a bunch of crap, even if the guy over from you is constipated and has a number of gut symptoms and is eating whatever the perfect diet would be.
And another thing is that these bacterial overgrowths can manifest outside of the gut as well and lead to a whole other host of problems. There's a certain parasite that if it infects a mouse, it'll have the mouse go try to actually fight a cat, so it gets eaten. So the parasite can then grow inside of the cat once the cat eats it. So it's kind of crazy. You'll see these videos of mice actually going to fight the cats, and it's the bacteria completely pretty much taking over. When plankton gets in SpongeBob's brain and starts controlling him. It's kind of very similar things. So it's especially the brain too that these bacteria could really have effect. Like a lot of people, myself included, when they start doing something like a carrot salad that reduces this endotoxin, can get a lot of mental benefits as well, like clearer thinking, less depression, less anxiety. Pretty heard that a couple times.
Yeah, it's so central to everything, and a lot of it is because serotonin, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a sec. But yeah, I mean, it activates a lot of the stress systems, and then chronic inflammation in general is a good way to knock down any of the things that you care about, whether it's producing dopamine or testosterone or et cetera, fertility. All of that gets shut down when you're inflamed. And, probably the prime reason that most people are inflamed is because of things that are going on in the gut. So, yeah, it really is central to all aspects of your life.
Well, and this connection between gut health and mental health is something that I've heard you guys talk a lot about. When you have issues with your gut, you can experience things like depression, anxiety, brain fog, and you kind of alluded to that. And one of the platitudes that you kind of hear regurgitated a lot is, serotonin is produced in the gut, right? That like more serotonin is produced in your gut than your brain. There's like the gut-brain connection, but it's often, usually when they're talking about like optimizing your mental health through your gut, it's through optimizing the production of serotonin, right? And the popular association with the word serotonin is it's the happy chemical, or it's associated with relaxation. You want more serotonin at night so that you can relax and go to sleep. And kind of that's one of the if you have more serotonin, you're generally happier and more chill. It's not quite the case, right? Like it's not exactly true in terms of it's one of the issues of like where the popular narrative is not 100% accurate. So let's talk a little bit about what serotonin actually does, and like what are the issues with like trying to crank your serotonin, and if it's not the happy chemical, what the hell is it?
It's a lot of things. I think it could be the chemical of hibernation. It could be the chemical of coldness. It could be the chemical of adverse behavior, of lack of impulse control. It could be probably most of all, it's the chemical of numbing, which is probably the most common thing that you'll hear. It's repeatedly reported if you administer people SSRIs acutely. A couple key things tend to happen. Number one, they stop caring about a lot of things, if not everything. A lot of these people will say things, like, "Oh, I'm normally like into this, but I just don't. It's just not there anymore. I just don't care." It's called anhedonia. So essentially, if you think of hedonism as a lot of pleasure, anhedonia would obviously be the lack of pleasure. And I think that's a lot because serotonin and dopamine tend to actually have this very antagonistic relationship. So dopamine can do things like stimulate your desire to go out and do things. It gives you a lot of pleasure. It's very good for athletic performance. It makes you want to keep going. But serotonin basically puts the brake on the output of dopamine, both at the level of the substantia nigra, which is part of your brain that puts out most of your dopamine, and just functionally tends to dampen the signal of dopamine. Dopamine's the signal of abundance. Things are good. Let's go out. Let's do things. Serotonin seems to be the complete opposite. When serotonin rises, it's kind of the signal that things are not good. We're going to slow things down. We're going to shut things down. We're going to basically numb yourself to the outside environment. We're going to restrict. We're going to restrain energy output. In fact, there was a review article pretty recently that was talking about why basically. I'm laughing, but it's actually really messed up. But talking about why certain serotonergic drugs are good for treating things like psychosis, and it's because it basically induces a hibernation state in the brain. And they were talking about ways to induce this hibernation state in the brain as a way to like restrict this psychosis. And like, that's the thing is that like you can show in a study that like, oh, like it helped with the psychosis in the same way that like, if you have a headache and I fucking chopped your head off, like that would get rid of your headache. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most optimal thing for you. So in those studies, they talk about administering serotonergic drugs as dramatically dropping the temperature of the brain. It also tends to do that systemically. If you administer serotonin, animals have a much easier time getting into hibernation because it really tends to suppress metabolic function, lower the body temperature. And when you're doing all those things, you're not going to be in a good mood, So if you think about, we just talked about endotoxins. So if you administer endotoxin to people, you will have a rise. Especially if it's in your gut, you will definitely have a systemic rise in your levels of serotonin. And, endotoxin is actually what tends to cause flu symptoms in a lot of people. So if you think about like if you're sick or you have a cold or something, and you kind of think of it as like, well, that's kind of like what excess endotoxin feels like. Are you happy? Like, no, you don't want to be bothered. Someone comes, hey, can you do this for me? Oh no, like just stop, like not right now. It's that kind of mindset. You kind of just want to like be to yourself. And the thing is like, it like reduces your energy expenditure. And so I guess you can think of that as it being relaxing, but you're not like really like resting super well. Like if you think about it, when you're sick, and you're like, whatever, just laying in bed all day, like you're not really feeling rested. You kind of feel like shit, but you just like don't have the energy to really get up and do anything. So that's what it is. Like, it's not like this, like, oh, it promotes this like deep, like euphoric type of rest and sleep and satisfaction with the world around you. That's not at all what it does in my estimation. And, I'm obviously oversimplifying things. People will say, oh, well, you need serotonin for this, you need serotonin for that. And it's true. Like, you need everything in your body for something, but that doesn't mean that we should be trying to upregulate our production of those things. Like, yeah, you need inflammation for sure. Does that mean that I want to do things to stimulate my inflammation? Absolutely not. So, that would be my kind of very long elevator ride pitch.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start. And there's so much more that we could dive into on that topic, but I wanted to give a little bit of space for some questions that I actually got from some of my audience as well. You mentioned earlier about one of your videos that you recently put out where people prior to the 1960s were eating diets where they were eating 3,000 or more calories a day, a quarter pound of sugar, like 100 grams of sugar or more, and they just seemed to be more metabolically healthy. They didn't have the same levels of obesity. They didn't seem to have a lot of the same issues in terms of just being overweight, even though they seem to have a higher calorie intake and a higher sugar intake. And one of the questions that I had specifically about that video is, why do you think that despite these improvements in metabolic health that we saw prior to the 60s, that between 1950 to 2007, life expectancy went from 66.5 to 79.3 years for men and 71.8 to 83.8 for women? What do you think the causative factors for this increase in lifespan are if our metabolic health is worse?
So there's a couple points. The first thing that I would say is that actually over the last couple of years, I believe life expectancy has actually started to go down again, which is obviously a pretty big black pill. But other than that, I think it's important to distinguish between life expectancy and then like average age of death. And it's, a topic that we want to dive into more. But life expectancy is like, okay, if you're born in a certain year, how long are you expected to live? That doesn't mean that like if you grew up in whatever era, if you were in your 20s or 30s throughout a certain era, that like you would live for that long necessarily. So I think that's important to look at. But it's true. I mean, people are living longer now. Well, I guess up until the last couple of years, people are living longer now than they were before. And I'm not here to deny that. I think what's important to look at is the causes of death. So a lot of times you'll hear things like, oh yeah, well, these people were eating all this and they were lean, but they all died at 65. And it's really not the case at all. If you go look at these death tables, there were plenty of people living into their 80s, 90s, even 100 plus. It's not like everyone just died at 65. A lot of that had to do with infant mortality, which we've drastically improved on over the last 100 to 1,000 years or so. There was times in Europe, I think throughout the 17 and 1800s when a baby when it was born was more likely to die within the first year of its life than it was to live. So obviously that's a huge factor in terms of life expectancy. You're not even talking about people dying in their 30s. You're talking about dragging the number down by literally killing the complete other end of the spectrum, right? So obviously that's going to have an insane effect on your life expectancy calculation. And the babies weren't dying because they were eating sugar. Like the babies were dying because the hospital conditions were poor. Maybe like mother immunity was poor for different reasons. But a lot of this comes down to infectious disease. So throughout the first half of the 20th century, the biggest concerns for human health were all of the infectious variety. And that's because people, historically before agriculture and before industry, we lived very separated out. We would have our own farms, et cetera, et cetera. And then you cram a bunch of people into cities and things, kind of all at the same time under the Industrial Revolution, 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. And then people are eating, they're drinking milk from factories. They're, they're having meat that was not like raised by their own. They're working in the city. All this is essentially a breeding ground for infectious disease. And this is before we had antibiotics. This is before we had vaccines. It's obviously another controversial topic, but it's also before we had a lot of knowledge about nutrition as well. And in the early 1900s, we started to discover that a lot of these vitamins, especially vitamins A and D, were extremely potent anti-infectious agents. And we didn't even know they existed before that, right? So people would be eating diets that were devoid of these things, or they were getting milk from a factory that was not like a farm-raised milk, that was nutrient poor and things like that. And they would become much more susceptible to infectious disease. And then you had a lot of introduction of vaccines and antibiotics in the early 20th century. And that played a huge role, as well as the nutrition, in mitigating a lot of these things. So that's where most of the death was coming from. It wasn't coming from metabolic diseases. You look at incidence of diabetes, incidence of Alzheimer's, incidence of depression, incidence of cancer, even age-adjusted. All of it's going up now. That's the burden that we're dealing with at this point in history. Maybe back then people might have died earlier, but it was not the same. It was not these like metabolic, like diet derived diseases of like energy metabolism that people were struggling with. It was infections, and it was like poor environmental conditions. So like there was poor sanitation, there was poor, we were just starting to figure out how to like house a bunch of people together. And animal agriculture was just beginning to, start to optimize a lot of these things in terms of keeping things clean. That's where a lot of this mortality came from. It was not people dying of diabetes and, being on medications for hypertension and things.
Perfectly coherent answer to me, because that's where my mind went, where it didn't necessarily come, because if you look, like you said, chronic disease with things like diabetes, cancer, heart disease, these things are going up, relative to, and like you said, it's a mind-blowing black pill that life expectancy is starting to go down. I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole right now. But and just being aware of your time, there was one more question that I had that I found particularly interesting that I'm going to, and I think it's actually I like to leave my listeners with practical nuggets by the end of these conversations, in terms of like, all right, you've heard all this stuff, where do you start? Because it's not going to be buying a bag of white sugar and slamming it down, and like, we don't do that. We had one guy ask, and I'm going to kind of like reshape his question a little bit. He said, dairy and sugar in my coffee makes me feel toxic, as well as high carbs in general. What does this mean, and how do I navigate towards tolerating more food and sugar? And I'm just going to add a little more context and add to his question. I had a friend who was kind of curious about adding sugar to his coffee as well, the pro-metabolic effects, and when he started to add and he comes from a background of doing a lot of fasting and eating very animal based, and so he started to add some sugar, and he noticed some brain fog and some weird symptoms that when it did not feel optimal to him. And I talked to him about it. It's like, realistically, you have poor glucose metabolism because of the different stressors that you put your body through. You train all the time, you fast all the time, and you don't functionally consume sugar in any capacity. How can people start to approach increasing their sugar intake and improving their glucose metabolism practically?
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that's very common. It's like, if you think about someone that maybe was obese or has a lot of trouble with their weight, it's a lot harder to get someone from that to being lean as it is for someone that's already lean to maintain their leanness, right? And that's because the body's in a completely different state, and it basically has the signal that, you know, we need to retain energy. Things are bad. Like, we're basically in hibernation mode, essentially. It's not exactly like that, of course, in circumstances like this. But yeah, I mean, if you've been restricting carbohydrates and things for quite some time, it can take a little bit of time for things to come back. Ultimately, I think a lot of it does come back to the gut. And I've been very interested in kind of just the adaptability of the gut and the gut immune system. So a lot of times people will be on restricted diets and then they reintroduce foods and they're like, oh, I had like loose bowels or I had skin problems or whatever. But that's like actually a perfectly normal response. If you haven't had the food in for a while, that would be like saying, you know, oh, I haven't hit legs in 4 years and I can't even squat the bar now. And it's like, yeah, I don't expect you to do more than that. So yeah, the body needs exposure in order to adapt to these things. So I would encourage people to, you know, take it low and slow, you know, start to reintroduce these things as you tolerate them. Obviously, don't just go crazy and start eating a completely different diet overnight. It's going to be impossible to figure out what's going wrong, and things will go wrong, I promise you. So yeah, I think a lot of times it is about like the source of the different foods and the carbs. So people often say like, oh, well, when I don't eat carbs, I feel so much better, but their carbs may have been coming from, you know, very questionable sources, wherever that might have been. If it's like flour that's enriched with a bunch of gums and dyes and fortified iron and things like that. So yeah, it's the actions of like carbohydrate on its own are completely different depending on what it's being packaged in, right? But in general, just some quick things if people want to try to improve their glucose tolerance. I think B vitamins are incredibly powerful. It can take a little bit of time to figure out like what kind of combination might work for you. But I think if you start out with like a B complex, see how it makes you feel. And then oftentimes like people will get some benefit, some like maybe like weird effects. And I think that's because, you know, everyone kind of comes from a different history and genetic background and all those different types of things. But just playing around with different B vitamins, because they are probably the most direct like energy, energy producing certain nutrients in the diet. So some of the big ones, obviously, that people like to play with are thiamine, which is B1. And then a lot of people really seem to get benefit from B3. So niacinamide is another big thing. But even other ones, I mean, some people respond extraordinarily well to things like biotin. And biotin isn't even thought of as being like an energy producing vitamin. People think about, oh, I take biotin for my nails or whatever. But like, you know, that plays a huge role in these things. So, you know, I would encourage people to think about supplementing B vitamins, even if you're eating a diet that is high in B vitamins. I mean, you know, we eat a bunch of eggs and meat and dairy, and we have liver too, and you know, we still benefit from taking B vitamins. And playing around with the doses and different combinations of that can be extremely powerful. I'm also a big fan of natural desiccated thyroid. I look at it as not really so much as a supplement. I look at it more as like, it's probably something that we would have just been eating anyway before we stopped kind of eating nose to tail. We would eat thyroid glands and we would eat other types of glands. So taking a natural desiccated thyroid product can be a really good way of ramping up the metabolism and especially the glucose metabolism. And then, yeah, just going down from there. I always encourage people to take a gut-centric approach, which is kind of what we're trying to do with Prism. But yeah, I do think at the end of the day, you know, the vitamins and the thyroid and maybe something like pregnenolone, those are all great. But if the gut's not working, then it kind of doesn't matter.
Nothing's gonna work, yeah.
Yeah.
And even with the generalized advice, one of the things that I always caution listeners, whether we were talking about biomechanics on the Art of Move, whenever we're on this podcast used to be the Art of Fuel, whenever there's advice that's generalized for health and nutrition, always realize that you have to take an individuated approach. You have to, this is the whole analyze and optimize thing. Listen to your body thing. But sometimes listening to your body and you don't know where to start. And so I think checking you guys out at Prism would be great, prism.miami, for your health consulting services. And that will help you find an individual approach to help you improve your glucose metabolism, help you improve your health overall, maybe your gut health, and taking that approach, making sure that you're not just following general advice that you heard on a podcast willy-nilly. Maybe you're, like maybe work with some professionals who can guide you and help you find that individual approach. That's why you guys are here. So go check out prism.miami. Go follow these guys on Twitter. They are just amazing, like the best Twitter account that you can have in terms of the stuff, the studies that they post, the takes that they have. It's outdoctrination. So if you're indoctrinated, get outdoctrinated, outdoctrination on Twitter. And then go check them out on YouTube, Analyze and Optimize, and same thing, Analyze and Optimize on Instagram. Anywhere else that I missed where you can be found?
Those are the main ones. Yep. Yeah, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Prism.
Yeah, those are the big ones. So
awesome.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks a ton for having us. And yeah, it's been great.
Thank you so much, guys. We're looking forward to getting this out to the world, and to anyone else who wants to learn more about this guy's stuff. Go check out all of their channels, because like there's so much information on here. Really appreciate having you guys on, and we'll catch everyone who was listening on the next episode of the Peak Players podcast.
All right, thanks so much.